The air inside L'Etoile always felt different. It wasn't just the air conditioning, which was always set to a perfect, cool temperature. It was thicker, heavy with the scent of expensive perfume, old wine from the cellar, and the faint, buttery aroma of the bread rolls that were replaced every 15 minutes. The lighting was soft, designed to make the crystal glasses sparkle and the gold trim on the plates glow. It was a world built to be beautiful, a world for people who owned beautiful things. And she moved through it like a ghost. She was a young woman, maybe 27 or 28, with tired eyes that had seen 1,000 nights just like this one. Her uniform was a simple black dress with a white apron tied neatly around her waist, a uniform designed to be forgotten. And she was, to the people seated in the plush velvet chairs, she was just a pair of hands that refilled a water glass, a voice that recited the day's specials, a shadow that cleared their plate when they were finished. They didn't see her. They saw the service. Her feet ached. It was a dull, constant throb that started in her heels and worked its way up her shins. She'd been on them for 9 hours already, with at least 2 more to go. The tray she carried felt heavy, not just with the weight of the 2 steaming cups of coffee and the tiny silver pot of cream, but with the weight of the expectations. Every step had to be precise, every movement measured. A wobble, a spill, a moment of clumsiness, and the perfect illusion of the restaurant would be broken. And in a place like this, you didn't break the illusion. She approached a table near the window. A man in a tailored suit was talking loudly into his phone, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the dining room. The woman with him, draped in diamonds, stared out into the city lights, looking bored. The young woman placed the coffee cups down without a sound. The porcelain met the saucer with a soft, satisfying click. It was a small skill, but one she had perfected over years, the art of being silent. As she turned to leave, the man held up a hand, not even looking at her. "More water," he barked into the phone, then to her, "and be quick about it." She gave a small, almost invisible nod. "Of course, sir." She didn't feel angry. It wasn't an emotion she had the luxury of anymore. It was just a fact. Like the sky being blue or the floor being marble. The man in the suit was important, and she was not. That was the rule of this world. On her way to the kitchen, she passed the grand piano in the corner. An older man with a neat gray beard was playing something soft and classical. It was nice, pleasant, the kind of music that filled the silence without demanding to be heard. But to her, it was just noise. Because in her head, a different symphony was playing. It always was. The clinking of a spoon against a ceramic cup would become a high, clear note. The low rumble of a man's laughter at a nearby table would transform into a deep, resonant cello chord. The gentle hiss of the espresso machine in the distance was a steady, rhythmic percussion. Her world was a constant, complex piece of music that only she could hear. Her fingers, resting on the edge of her tray, would often move on their own, tapping out a silent, frantic rhythm against the metal. A flurry of 16th notes, a complex arpeggio, a dramatic crescendo that existed only in her mind. It was a secret she kept, a language only she understood. It was the thing that made the ache in her feet and the knot in her stomach bearable. It was her escape. She watched the people as she worked. They were a different species. Their worries were not her worries. They argued over stock prices and art deals. They planned trips to private islands and complained about the service on their private jets. She heard snippets of their lives as she leaned over to pour their wine. "The merger is almost complete. We'll be celebrating in Monaco." The gallery owner simply refused to believe it was an original. "Darling, if you buy that yacht, what will we do about the villa in Tuscany?" She felt no envy. It was too distant for that. It was like watching a movie about a fantasy land. You could appreciate the scenery, but you never really felt like you could step through the screen. Her reality was the weight of the tray, the sting of the hot plate on her bare skin, the constant smiling, yes, of course, right away. That was her most used phrase. Her shift finally ended. The last of the diners left, stumbling slightly into the cool night air, their laughter echoing down the street. The magic of the restaurant seemed to fade with them. The lights were turned up, revealing scuff marks on the floor and a slight weariness in the velvet chairs. The staff began the long process of cleaning, of turning the fantasy world back into a workplace. She changed out of her uniform, her body feeling heavy with exhaustion. The simple black dress was replaced by jeans and a worn-out sweater. The transformation was complete. The invisible waitress was just a young woman going home. The walk to her small apartment was 20 minutes. She didn't mind it. It was a time to let the noise in her head settle down. The city streets were her own symphony now. The screech of a taxi's brakes, the wail of a distant siren, the rhythmic thump of bass from a car passing by. It was a messy, chaotic, but honest kind of music. Her apartment was on the fourth floor of a plain brick building. It was small and the elevator was always broken. But when she unlocked her door and stepped inside, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. This was her space. It wasn't glamorous like the restaurant. The furniture was mismatched, a collection of things she'd found at flea markets or been given by friends. But it was real. There were no gold trimmings, no crystal glasses, just a comfortable sofa, a small kitchen table, and a window that looked out onto another brick wall. She dropped her keys into a bowl by the door and slipped off her shoes, sighing as her feet were finally free. The silence in the room was a welcome embrace. She went to the small fridge and took out a bottle of water, drinking half of it in one go. And then she saw it. In the corner of the living room, covered by a thin layer of dust, stood an old electric keyboard. It was nothing special. The plastic casing was yellowed with age, and some of the letters above the keys had faded away. It was an ugly, outdated piece of equipment. But to her, it was the most beautiful object in the world. She walked over to it, her tired feet suddenly feeling a little lighter. She didn't sit down. She didn't turn it on. She just stood there for a long moment, looking at it. Her fingers, which had been tapping out silent melodies on serving trays all night, now rested gently on the cool, smooth plastic of the keys. They were still. They were home. She stood there for a long moment, her fingers resting on the cool, yellowed keys of the old keyboard. The silence in the small apartment felt heavy, but it was a comfortable weight, a blanket she had wrapped around herself for years. It was a different kind of silence from the one at the restaurant. That silence was full of unspoken rules and quiet judgment. This silence was hers. It was empty, waiting to be filled. Finally, she pulled out the small, worn bench and sat down. The familiar groan of the metal legs was a welcome sound. She switched the power on and the small green light blinked to life. There was a faint hum, a quiet promise of the sounds to come. She didn't need to look at the music books stacked haphazardly beside her. The music was all in her head, a library of melodies she had locked away a long time ago. Her fingers, which had been stiff and tired from carrying trays, began to move slowly, hesitantly at first. They played a simple scale, up and down, the notes a little out of tune but clear in the quiet room. It was like saying hello to an old friend. As the simple notes filled the air, a memory surfaced, unbidden. It wasn't a sharp, clear picture, but more like a feeling, a warmth spreading through her chest. She was 7 years old, sitting at a real piano, a huge, polished wooden beast that took up most of the living room in the small house she grew up in. The sun was streaming through the window, making dust motes dance in the light like tiny, sparkling fairies. Her father was sitting beside her on the bench, his big, calloused hand gently resting on her back. "That's it," he had whispered, his voice full of a pride she didn't fully understand then. "Just like that. Don't force it. Let your fingers find their way." She remembered the smell of his shirt, a mix of soap and sawdust from the construction site where he worked. She remembered the feeling of the smooth ivory keys under her small fingers, so much more real than the plastic ones she was touching now. Back then, the piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a playground. Her fingers would scamper across the keys like excited puppies, chasing after a melody. Her teacher, a stern man with a neat gray mustache, would often just stare at her, his pen frozen above his notepad. He would shake his head in disbelief, not because she was making mistakes, but because she wasn't. She heard him tell her mother once, "Her hands, They don't just play the notes. They understand them. It's a gift you can't teach. Her parents had sacrificed so much for those lessons. Her mother took on extra sewing jobs, her father worked overtime. They never complained. They just smiled when she played, their faces lit with a hope that she was their ticket to a better life, a life they could only dream of. They would save up for months to buy tickets to the symphony, sitting in the highest, cheapest seats, just so she could see the professionals, to watch their hands fly across the strings and keys. Those were the days when her world was full of music. The rhythm of the dishwasher, the chirping of birds outside her window, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, it all blended together into a happy, chaotic symphony. And she was its conductor. But symphonies, she learned, can end suddenly. The memory shifted, the warm sunlight replaced by a gray, heavy chill. She was 16. The music in the house had stopped. The big wooden piano in the living room was now silent, its lid closed, collecting a fine layer of dust that no one bothered to wipe away. The hushed, worried whispers of her parents had replaced the sound of her practice. The words accident, hospital, and no insurance hung in the air like a thick fog. Her father, the man whose hands had guided hers on the piano, was now lying in a hospital bed, his body broken, his future uncertain. The world she knew had tilted on its axis and everything was falling off. The medical bills were like a monster, eating away at their small savings. Then came the notices on the door, the red final warning letters. Her mother's sewing machine, which used to hum late into the night, was now silent. The pride in her parents' eyes was replaced by a deep, weary sadness she couldn't bear to look at. The piano lessons were the first thing to go. It wasn't even a discussion. It was just a quiet understanding. The teacher came by one last day, not to teach, but to say goodbye. He told her to never stop playing, that her gift was too precious to lose. But he didn't understand. The music had become tied to her pain. Every note she tried to play was a reminder of what she had lost, of the family that was breaking apart. The joy was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. So she closed the lid on the piano and on that part of her life. A few months later, they had to sell the house. The piano was the first thing to go, sold for a fraction of what it was worth to a man who didn't even play. He just liked the way it looked in his living room. She watched from the sidewalk as they loaded it onto a truck, feeling like a piece of her own soul was being carried away. Back in her small apartment, the music she was playing on the old keyboard changed. The simple, happy melody from her childhood morphed into something else. It became more complex, more intense. Her fingers, which had been moving gently, now pressed down on the keys with a fierce energy. The notes were no longer just notes. They were words. They were years of unspoken grief, of frustration, of loneliness. They were the story of the girl who had to grow up too fast, who traded her dreams for a steady paycheck to help her family survive. She played with her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly. The cheap speakers of the keyboard strained to keep up with the passion she poured into the music. It wasn't perfect. There were mistakes, notes that were slightly off, moments of hesitation. But it was honest. It was more honest than anything she had said or done in the last 10 years. This was her confession. This was her prayer. She played until her fingers ached and a tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just let it fall, a small, salty offering to the ghost of the girl she used to be. When the final note faded, the silence that returned to the room was different. It was no longer empty. It was full. It was heavy with the echo of the music, full of the memories and the emotions she had just set free. She opened her eyes and looked at her hands, resting on the worn keys. They were the same hands that cleared dirty dishes and refilled water glasses for people who didn't see her. But they were also the hands that could create this. This was her secret. This was the one thing they could never take from her. And in the quiet of her small, plain apartment, surrounded by the mismatched furniture and the view of a brick wall, she was not a waitress. She was a musician. And for a little while longer, that was enough. The Friday night rush at L'Etoile was like a storm. It didn't arrive. It just was a chaotic force of noise and energy that the staff had to navigate like sailors in a gale. The air buzzed with 100 different conversations. The clinking of glasses formed a constant, high-pitched chime, and the kitchen doors swung open and closed like a beating heart, releasing gusts of hot, fragrant air. She was in the middle of it all, her body moving on autopilot, her mind a calm center in the whirlwind. She carried a tray laden with half-empty champagne flutes, weaving between tables with an instinctual grace, her eyes scanning for the next need, the next empty hand, the next request. In the corner of the room, the usual soft, classical melody drifted from the grand piano. The old pianist, a man who had been playing here for as long as she had worked there, was a fixture like the velvet curtains or the crystal chandeliers. His music was pleasant, a gentle soundtrack to the evening that never demanded attention. But tonight, something was wrong. A note hung in the air, dissonant and jarring. Then another. The gentle melody faltered, stumbled, and stopped. A strange, sudden silence fell over that corner of the room, a small pocket of quiet in the middle of the storm. She turned her head and saw him. The old man was slumped over the keys, his forehead resting on the ivory, his body limp. A woman at a nearby table let out a small gasp. The manager, a thin man with a perpetually worried face whose name she could never remember, rushed over, his usual brisk walk replaced by a panicked shuffle. The next few minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. 2 waiters carefully lifted the old pianist and helped him to a back office. An ambulance was called in hushed, urgent tones. The dining room, for a moment, held its breath. But then the storm resumed. The conversation started up again, a little louder this time, fueled by the small drama. But the silence in the corner remained. The piano stood empty, a black, polished monolith. And the manager was pacing back and forth near the kitchen doors, looking like a man about to face a firing squad. She could see the sweat beading on his forehead. To him, this wasn't a medical emergency. It was a catastrophe. The ambiance was ruined. The illusion was broken. The elite patrons of Latoil paid for perfection, and a silent, empty corner was not perfect. He looked at his staff, his eyes darting from face to face, but he found no solution there. The busboys couldn't play. The other waitresses couldn't play. He was a man drowning, and there were no life rafts in sight. Then his eyes landed on her. She was wiping down a table, her hands moving in their usual efficient, circular motions. As she worked, her fingers were tapping out a silent, frantic rhythm on the damp cloth. It was a habit she couldn't break, a secret language she spoke without knowing. A strange, desperate look came into the manager's eyes. He remembered. He remembered seeing her do that 100 times. He remembered her once mentioning in a quiet voice a year ago that she used to play. It was a crazy idea, a stupid idea, but it was the only one he had. He marched over to her, his step sharp and purposeful. "You," he said, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "You play, don't you?" She looked up, startled. A long time ago." A little, the desperation in his eyes was terrifying. "Good, that's good enough." The piano, now. Her blood ran cold. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't, not here." "You will?" he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. It wasn't a request. It was an order. "Do you want to keep your job? The ambiance of this restaurant is on the line. Go." He pointed a trembling finger towards the empty stage. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. Every step towards the piano was an effort. The 20 feet between her station and the corner of the room felt like a mile-long walk of shame. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes on her. The whispers followed her. "Who is she? Is that the waitress? What's going on?" She felt their stares like physical touches, pricking at her skin, judging her plain uniform, her tired face. She was an imposter, a fraud being pushed onto a stage where she didn't belong. She reached the piano and sat down on the cold leather bench. The polished wood of the grand piano felt immense and intimidating. Her hands, which had been tapping out confident rhythms just moments ago, were now shaking uncontrollably. She placed them on the keys, and her fingers felt like clumsy, foreign objects. The room was watching. The man in the tailored suit who had barked at her for water was watching, a look of amused contempt on his face. The bored woman with the diamonds was watching, one eyebrow raised in curiosity. The entire room was a jury, and she was guilty of the crime of being ordinary. She took a deep, shaky breath and pressed down on a key. The note that came out was thin and hesitant, completely wrong. A few people chuckled softly. Her face burned with humiliation. Another note, just as weak. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear. She closed her eyes. She couldn't look at them anymore. She blocked out the faces, the whispers, the judgment. She pretended she wasn't in a restaurant. She imagined she was back in her small apartment, the door locked, the world shut out. She was just playing for herself. Her fingers stopped shaking. They remembered. They remembered the feel of the keys, the language of the music. She started again, not with a complex melody, but with a simple, sad little tune. It was the first song her father had ever taught her. The notes were clear and pure now, filled with a longing that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The quiet chuckles died. The low hum of conversation began to fade. The simple melody grew, branching out into more complex patterns. It was no longer just a sad little tune. It was a story. It spoke of a bright, happy beginning, of a sunlit room and a father's proud smile. Then the music shifted. A dark, dissonant chord crept in, full of pain and confusion. The tempo became frantic, desperate, reflecting the chaos of a life falling apart. It was the sound of a young girl's world shattering. She played with an intensity that surprised even herself. Her fingers flew across the keys, no longer clumsy but powerful and sure. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was pouring 10 years of unspoken grief, 10 years of quiet struggle, 10 years of a locked-away soul into the music. The room was utterly silent now. Not a single fork clinked against a plate. Not a single voice whispered. The entire restaurant, the entire world of the elite, had been captivated. The man in the tailored suit had put his phone down, his mouth slightly agape. The woman with the diamonds was leaning forward, her bored expression replaced by one of deep emotional engagement. They weren't just hearing music. They were feeling it. They were feeling the raw, unfiltered truth of a human life, a life so different from their own, yet filled with emotions they all understood. They were seeing the invisible waitress, and for the first time, they truly saw her. The music swelled to a powerful, heartbreaking crescendo, a cry of both pain and defiance. And then, as gently as it had begun, it softened. The frantic notes subsided, the dark chords resolved into something hopeful, something beautiful. It was the sound of survival, of finding a light in the darkness. The final note hung in the air, shimmering and pure, before fading into a profound, stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, held in the grip of what they had just witnessed. Then, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, the silence was broken by a wave of thunderous, overwhelming applause. It was not the polite, obligatory clapping they gave the regular pianist. This was something else. It was an explosion of appreciation, of awe, of sheer, unadulterated wonder. She opened her eyes, dazed as if waking from a dream. She saw them all standing, their faces filled with an emotion she couldn't name. It was too much. The attention, the exposure, it was terrifying. She didn't take a bow. She didn't acknowledge the applause. She simply stood up, turned, and almost fled, walking quickly back to the safety of the kitchen, leaving the stunned elite and their roaring ovation behind her. The roar of the applause followed her into the kitchen, a sound so foreign and overwhelming it felt like a physical force pushing her forward. She stumbled through the swinging doors, leaving the stunned silence and the standing ovation behind, and collapsed against a cold, stainless steel counter. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. and her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists to stop the trembling. The hot, greasy air of the kitchen, usually a source of comfort, felt suffocating. The other kitchen staff stopped what they were doing, staring at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. They had heard the music, of course. They had heard the silence that followed, and then the explosion of sound from the dining room. But to them, she was still just the quiet waitress who kept to herself. The manager burst in a moment later, his face a mask of pure disbelief. His usual composure was gone, replaced by a frantic energy. He looked at her, then at the swinging doors, as if expecting the entire restaurant to follow her in. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Who are you?" She couldn't answer. She just shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't know who she was anymore. The invisible waitress was gone, and in her place was someone she didn't recognize. Someone who had just bared her soul to a room full of strangers and was now terrified of the consequences. Out in the dining room, the spell was slowly beginning to break. People were sitting down, their conversations starting up again, but they were different now. The talk was not of stock prices or art deals. It was of her, of the music, of the raw, breathtaking emotion that had filled the room. And at a small table in the back, a man in his late 50s, with a thoughtful, lined face and silver hair at his temples, remained seated. He was Julian Vance, a pianist widely regarded as one of the greatest living musicians. He was famously reclusive, rarely giving interviews and almost never attending public events unless he was performing. He had come to Let Oil simply for a quiet meal, a rare escape from the pressures of his own world. He had prepared to ignore the restaurant's usual background music, the bland, inoffensive melodies that were the hallmark of such places. But what he heard from the waitress at the piano was not background music. It was a voice, a raw, unpolished, but undeniably brilliant voice that spoke of a life of struggle and a depth of feeling he hadn't encountered in years. In the world of classical music, he was surrounded by technical perfection. Young pianists who could play the most difficult passages with flawless precision, but whose music often felt empty, like a beautiful house with no one living inside. Her music, on the other hand, was full of life. It was messy and imperfect, but it was honest. It was the sound of a human heart, beating and breaking and hoping all at once. He was captivated. When she fled the stage, a part of him wanted to follow, but he knew he had to wait. He finished his meal slowly, his mind replaying the phrases she had played, the way she had bent the tempo, the sheer emotional force behind every note. He knew he had just witnessed something rare, a raw diamond hidden in plain sight. He had to find her. An hour later, her shift finally over, she slipped out the back door into the cool night air of the alley. The city's hum was a welcome distraction, a return to normalcy. She pulled her worn sweater tighter around her, her body still trembling from the adrenaline and the shock of the evening. She just wanted to go home, to her small apartment, to the safety of her old keyboard, and pretend none of this ever happened. "Excuse me." The voice was calm and quiet, cutting through the silence of the alley. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man was standing there, his silhouette illuminated by the single bare bulb above the back door. It was the man from the corner table, the one who had watched her with such intensity. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, taking a gentle step forward. "My name is Julian Vance." She stared at him, the name meaning nothing to her. She took a step back, her guard up. "I don't want any trouble." "No, of course not," he said, his hands held up in a peaceful gesture. I had to speak to you. What you did in there, it was extraordinary." She felt a wave of suspicion. Was this a joke? Was one of the rich diners playing a cruel trick on her? "I don't know what you're talking about," she mumbled, turning to walk away. "The way you played the transition into the minor key," he said, his voice stopping her in her tracks. "It wasn't just a change in harmony. It was a shift in the entire atmosphere of the room. You were telling a story. About loss, I think. And then the hope at the end. The way you resolved that final chord. It was perfect." She turned back to face him, her eyes wide. He wasn't just flattering her. He had listened. He had understood. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice softer this time. "Like I said, my name is Julian Vance. I'm a pianist," he said simply. He saw no flicker of recognition in her eyes, and for some reason that pleased him. It meant her reaction to him would be genuine. "I have a small foundation, a program for young musicians with exceptional talent. I've been doing it for 20 years, and I have never heard anything like what I heard from you tonight." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your talent is raw. It's been locked away for a long time. But it's there. It's a rare and precious thing. And I believe I can help you find it again." She just stood there, speechless. It was too much. A few hours ago, she was a nameless waitress. Now, a stranger was offering her... What? A dream she had buried a decade ago? It felt impossible. "This is a joke," she finally said, her voice cracking. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because music like that deserves to be heard," he said, his voice filled with a quiet passion. "Not just by the people in a restaurant, by the world. You have a voice, and you've been silent for too long. Let me help you speak again." He pulled a card from his pocket and held it out to her. It was a simple, elegant card with just his name and a phone number. "Think about it," he said. "Call me tomorrow. Or don't. But know that what you have is a gift. Don't let it die in that alley." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, the small card feeling like the heaviest thing in the world. The next few days were a blur. She went to work, but everything was different. The other staff looked at her with a new respect. The manager treated her with a strange, nervous deference. The customers whispered as she passed. The story of the waitress who could play was spreading like wildfire through the city's elite circles. She was no longer invisible. She was a mystery, and she was terrified. She held on to the card, looking at it a dozen times a day. It felt like a key to a door she had long since locked and thrown away. Finally, on her day off, sitting in the quiet of her apartment, she made the call. His voice on the other end was calm and reassuring. He didn't pressure her. He just asked her to come to his studio. His studio was not what she expected. It wasn't a flashy, modern building. It was a large, quiet room above an old bookshop, filled with natural light, shelves of sheet music, and two magnificent grand pianos. It felt like a sanctuary. "Before we agree to anything," he said, "play for me. Not what you played at the restaurant. Play something for yourself. Something you love." She sat at one of the pianos, her hands trembling. She hadn't played on a real grand piano since she was a teenager. The touch of the keys was incredible, a feather-light response that her old keyboard could never replicate. She closed her eyes and began to play. It was a simple sonata by Mozart, one of the first pieces she had ever learned. Her fingers were rusty, her timing unsure. She stumbled through a passage, her frustration growing. "Stop," he said gently. He came and sat beside her on the bench. He didn't criticize her. He just placed his own hands on the keys, a few inches from hers. "You're trying too hard," he said softly. "You're fighting the music. You have all this emotion inside you, and you're trying to force it out. You don't need to force it. You just need to let it breathe." He played the passage she had stumbled on, but his version was different. It wasn't just technically perfect. It was filled with a gentle, breathing life. He wasn't showing off. He was explaining. He was teaching her a new language. For the next hour, they sat side by side. He didn't give her a lecture. He just played and she listened. He showed her how to find the spaces between the notes, how to let a melody unfold naturally. It was the most profound musical lesson she had ever had. For the first time in a decade, she felt not like a student trying to please a teacher, but like a fellow artist, exploring the possibilities of sound. When she left the studio that day, she knew she would be back. She went to the restaurant that evening and handed the manager her resignation. He didn't try to stop her. He just nodded, a look of understanding on his face. "I knew you weren't meant to be clearing tables," he said. Her new life began. The training was intense but exhilarating. She spent her days in the quiet studio with Julian, a man who was not just a teacher but a mentor, a friend who understood the language of her soul. He gave her a proper piano to practice on, a beautiful used instrument that now sat in the corner of her apartment, replacing the old, yellowed keyboard. The story of the mystery pianist from L'Etoile continued to grow. It became a legend among the city's elite, a whispered tale of incredible raw talent discovered in the most. The night of the performance arrived with a strange, quiet calm. The concert hall was a world away from anything she had ever known. It wasn't like the cozy, fake elegance of L'Etoile. This was a different kind of grandness. It was vast and imposing, with high, curved ceilings that seemed to swallow sound and plush red seats that stretched back like a velvet sea. The air was thick with a scent of old wood, perfume, and anticipation. Backstage, in the small, plain room that was her temporary sanctuary, the sounds from the hall were a muffled, distant rumble. It was the sound of 1,000 people settling in, 1,000 programs rustling, 1,000 whispered conversations. She sat on a simple wooden chair, her hands resting in her lap, trying to control the trembling that threatened to return. Her mentor, the old pianist, sat opposite her, not saying a word. He just sipped his tea, his presence a calm, steady anchor in the storm of her nerves. He didn't give her a pep talk. He didn't tell her to break a leg. He just looked at her and gave a small, slow nod. It was all the encouragement she needed. It was a look that said, "I know what you have in you. Now let them know." A stagehand popped his head in the door. 5 minutes, he said, his voice flat and professional. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She stood up and smoothed the fabric of her dress. It was a simple, elegant navy blue, a gift from her mentor. It wasn't flashy, but it felt right. It felt like her. She walked towards the stage door, the heavy velvet curtain brushing against her arm. She could hear her name being announced, but it sounded like someone else's name, a character in a story she was reading. The stagehand gave her a final nod and the curtain began to part. The walk to the piano was the longest walk of her life. A single, warm spotlight followed her, isolating her in the middle of the enormous stage. The sea of faces blurred into a single, living entity. She could feel their collective gaze, 1,000 pairs of eyes fixed on her. But this time it felt different. It wasn't the cold, judgmental stare of the restaurant. It was a look of intense curiosity, of open-hearted expectation. She scanned the front rows and saw them. The man in the tailored suit, looking less confident and more intrigued than she had ever seen him. The woman with the diamonds, her expression not one of boredom, but of genuine anticipation. They were all there, the ghosts from her old life, waiting to see if the legend was real. She reached the piano and sat down on the bench. The polished wood of the concert grand felt cool and solid beneath her fingers. The black and white keys seemed to glow under the bright lights. For a moment the fear returned. A flash of memory from the restaurant, the shaky, wrong notes, the soft chuckles from the crowd. Her fingers froze. She took a deep breath, just as her mentor had taught her. She let the fear wash over her, and then she let it go. She wasn't that waitress anymore. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes were simple, almost hesitant. It was a quiet melody, a question asked in the dark. It was the sound of her small apartment, the feeling of loneliness, the years of silence. The audience leaned in, captivated by the intimacy of the sound. Then the music began to grow. The simple melody twisted and turned, becoming more complex, more urgent. It was the sound of her life at the restaurant, the clatter of dishes, the constant, frantic motion, the silent symphony that played only in her head. Her fingers began to fly across the keys, a flurry of motion that was both chaotic and precise. It was the sound of a talent that could not be contained, a spirit that refused to be broken. She played with a passion that was almost frightening. She wasn't just performing. She was reliving every moment of her journey. The fast, powerful passages were her years of struggle, her anger at the hand life had dealt her. The slow, haunting melodies were her grief for her father, for the dreams she had lost. She poured everything into the music, every unspoken word, every hidden tear, every ounce of her soul. The audience was mesmerized. The man in the tailored suit had completely forgotten his phone. He was leaning forward, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. He wasn't just hearing music. He was being told a story of a life he couldn't imagine but could feel deep in his bones. The woman with the diamonds had a single, perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek, smudging her makeup slightly. She didn't notice. She was completely lost in the raw emotion of the music. The critics in the front row, who had come prepared to write a clever, dismissive review of the Waitress prodigy, had put down their pens. They weren't analyzing the technical perfection of the performance. They were too busy feeling it. They were witnessing something that transcended skill, something that came from a place so deep and so honest that it left no room for criticism. The music swelled into a powerful, breathtaking crescendo, a storm of sound that filled the enormous hall, a cry of both pain and triumph. It was the sound of a woman who had been invisible for so long, finally roaring into existence. And then, as gently as it had begun, it softened. The storm passed, leaving behind a melody of pure, clear hope. It was the sound of her finding her way again, of the kindness of her mentor, of the second chance she had been given. The final note hung in the air, shimmering and alone, before fading into a profound, absolute silence. The silence was the most powerful part of the performance. It lasted for what felt like an eternity. No one moved. No one breathed. The entire hall was frozen, held captive by the echo of the music. It was a silence filled with all the emotions she had just poured out: grief, joy, struggle, and hope. Then, from the back of the hall, a single person began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound, full of respect and awe. Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, the silence was shattered by an explosion of sound. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar. It was a wave of thunderous, overwhelming emotion that crashed over the stage. The entire audience was on its feet, their faces turned towards her, their expressions a mixture of shock, admiration, and pure, unadulterated wonder. She opened her eyes, which she hadn't even realized were closed, and saw them all. The elite, the critics, the people from her old life, they were all standing for her. She slowly stood up from the piano and walked to the front of the stage. The lights were blinding, but she could still see their faces. She was no longer a ghost, a shadow, a nameless waitress. She was seen. She took a deep, shaky bow, not as a performer for an audience, but as a human being who had finally shared her true self with the world. Back in the wings, her mentor watched, a quiet, proud smile on his face. He had not just taught a woman to play the piano again. He had helped a soul find its voice. And as the roar of the crowd washed over her, she knew, with a certainty that filled every corner of her being, that she was finally, truly home.